haven't done so already, go ahead and open up to Malachi chapter 1. If you're not very familiar with the Old Testament, Malachi is the last book of the Old Testament, so you can find the book of Matthew, just take a left. You're almost there. Whenever you just think about the book of Malachi, Malachi being a prophet, tell me what comes to mind. Eric. A disobedient teenager. I can understand that thought. Not Malachi. He's not a disobedient teenager. But the themes that run through the book. No honor for father. Any others? Robbing God. Can a man rob God? Certainly so. Maybe not what you would imagine. Anything else stick out to you from the book? Prophecies about John the Baptist, a man by the name, the prophecies about Elijah, and of course John the Baptist is going to fulfill those things. Even Jesus himself is going to say it, so there's no way to miss it. Anything else? Right. Worship is designed for God and not us. That's an excellent point. Excellent. Anything else? Anything else stick out to you? 4 chapters, about 55 verses. We have about 8 weeks to cover it. So that means we don't have to move terribly fast. Usually it seems like I'm on hot coals and we got to just go through things really fast and hit through. So we'll be able to take a little bit more time. I don't know about you, but whenever I was younger, when you start going through these prophets toward the end of the Old Testament, it was kind of hard for me to find the chronology of things, of how some of these books intermingled in terms of having contemporaries and other events that took place, and knowing that they were in place to work together. If you start really thinking through the events, and I'm not going to go back too far, but about 130 to 140 years before Malachi comes with this message from God to Israel. If you go that far back, the children of Israel are still in captivity. The children of Judah are in captivity. And so the stories that begin, kind of where you get to with Malachi, go all the way back to prophets like Ezra, where Ezra is a priest and a scribe, and he is sent by Cyrus, a king that God had talked about in Isaiah 150 years before this, saying, they're going to raise up my servant, a king by the name of Cyrus, and he's going to send my people, and they're going to go back to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And so sure enough, happens exactly the way God says, and Ezra goes back. And his job is to get things up and going. As this takes place, they get back and they start the process to build the temple, and then they kind of tail off. They start looking around and they start building their own houses. And then you get other prophets in the Old Testament, like the prophet of Haggai. And he has to bring about a message to say, oh, you don't care about God's house? You live in paneled houses? But you haven't restored the temple? And so here they come around, and God has to send this message to his people. There's another prophet by the name of Zechariah who has similar things to say. Why are you not paying attention to God? Why are you not putting his things first? And so then as things continue, then you get over, and after Ezra, now they start to work on the temple gets completed, then you get a man by the name of Nehemiah is sent. Remember, he's going to come back to be the governor, but he's a cupbearer for the king. And so he comes in a day and he says, you know, the city of Jerusalem is just in shambles, and he looks so sad that the king asks him why he's so sad, and he tells them. And the king sends Nehemiah to Jerusalem to build the wall. and even provides finances to do it. And so Nehemiah comes back, and the wall around Jerusalem is restored. And so as these events take place, you go, God has sent His people back with full money to do it from the countries that they were taken captive in. The temple gets rebuilt, gets restored. The wall in Jerusalem gets built back around it. They get protection. And out of all these things, everything that God has provided, by the time Malachi shows up, there's still one major problem. The people of Israel, even the Jews, and you'll notice within the book of Malachi, you're going to see Israel, you're going to see Judah, you're going to see Levites. They just don't have a heart for God. Now, through the book, you're going to see things along these lines. You would give more honor to your governor than you would to God. You find God saying, you're not going to show me any honor. I wish somebody there was just wise enough to know to go shut the gates on the temple. Why do you even offer up sacrifices when there's no heart behind it? He says, you're basically just going through the motions. You're just doing the externals. The heart's not part of it. And then as he continues through the book, then you come and he starts to talk about the priests. He says, they don't care about the knowledge of God. They want to just give whatever they want to about what God desires. And then you just see it continue to move through the book and comes down to the part where the statements are made. These people don't have a desire for God. They don't offer up the sacrifices right. They're robbing God of what He deserves. And all of a sudden, God makes this big statement. He says, I'm going to bring about a judgment. I'm going to bring it down. And you're going to have to decide which side of that judgment you want to be on. Do you want to have a heart for me? Or do you just want to be heartless in how you go about things? You can tell there's plenty of application in here for us. I mean, these events are roughly 2,400 years ago in Malachi. 400 years before Jesus. And to go, what happened to them with not having a heart for God is the exact same thing that happens in our homes, our marriages, our communities, when there's no longer Jesus as central. It just becomes heartless, and it really becomes worthless. They had become so rebellious or self-centered that they didn't care about marriage. They didn't care about their children. Fathers didn't have a heart for their children. He says marriage was so looked down on that they would just take one and then move on and take the next one. And there wasn't any concern for honoring God within the home, within the nation, and even for them to go, not even at the temple, God not being honored. You realize how easy is it for us to not honor Jesus in our own marriages, as parents, and even within the church. And you come to clearly understand the book of Malachi, if you see these principles brought out, you see the parallels that hit us right in the face for where we are now. Now, I want you to start off, look over at Malachi chapter 3. I'm going to show you how bad it was. Malachi chapter 3. I want you to look down at verse 18. Well, actually, look at 17 and 18. There are going to be a group of people who do turn to the Lord. It's not going to be the whole group of them, but there are going to be some. Malachi chapter 3, look at 17 and 18. He says, they will be mine. He says, I'm going to take them for my possession, those who actually fear me. He says the Lord of hosts, on the day that I prepare my own possession, and I will spare them as a man spares his own son who serves him. Notice it's not the picture of partiality of, I'm just going to spare my son. He says, as a man spares the son who does what? Serves him. There's obedience. Now, look at how far down, whenever you don't give honor, where it takes you. Because look at what he's going to restore in verse 18. So you will again distinguish between the righteous and the wicked, between one who serves God and one who does not serve him. Whenever there's not honor for God, what can you no longer tell the difference between? You can't even tell the difference between righteous people and wicked people. Because they didn't fear God and weren't honoring him, they didn't have enough wisdom to even know whether people were righteous or wicked. Now, it'd be real easy to take this and say, you know what, we live in a world, they don't know the difference between right and wrong anymore. That's not who he's talking about. Who's Malachi written to? The nations? It's written to God's people. So what happens when God's people don't honor God anymore? What are we going to lose the ability to do? We won't be able to tell righteous from wicked. Now, sometimes, and I know we get into certain situations and we go, boy, I never had to think about this before. What is the right thing to do? But what about if you don't even have the ability to look through and find? That's what happens when you don't honor God anymore. When you don't honor him out of what's right. Now we get to the point where we can't even tell, is this the right thing to do or not? And all of a sudden you just start tailing off. And even though God may have provided us with homes to live in, provided us with a place to gather to worship, you'll find a bunch of people who are heartless in their worship. And that's what the problem was for those who were here in Israel. They had lost their heart because they didn't honor God. Now, come back to the very beginning of the book, Malachi chapter 1. Just the name Malachi, do you know what it means? You might have a footnote. It means my messenger. That's what Malachi means in Hebrew. My messenger. And in other words, in this setting, my messenger is God's messenger. Do these people need a message from God? Yes. Do we need a message from God? Certainly. Malachi is kind of a unique character in one sense. If it doesn't start off here in verse 1 to tell you his name, you wouldn't know his name. And that's the only time, in verse 1 here, is the only time that the name Malachi is used in all the scriptures. We don't know anything else about Malachi, his life, what was going on, other than the fact of God used him. This is my messenger. Now look at Malachi chapter 1, verse 1. The oracle of the word of the Lord to Israel through Malachi. What does Malachi come to bring? I'm going to tell you the word of the Lord. Now, this is already a problem in Israel because the priests that were serving at the temple, they weren't so concerned about the things of the Lord. They were concerned about, well, how can we come out ahead on the money side? How can we shortchange God in our sacrifices? They wouldn't even offer up sacrifices that were actually unblemished anymore, which is ironic because it really did stand for who they were. In sacrifices, whenever you would put your hand on that animal under the old covenant, the sacrificial system, you were saying, this animal is going to stand for me in this offering, in this sacrifice. And they were bringing in animals that were blind, lame, sick. They're saying, I want this animal to stand for me. Isn't it kind of ironic? When you don't honor God, where does it leave you? How are they doing spiritually? Blind. Think about it. They were sick among them. And to think, lame, they didn't have a leg to stand on before God. You realize this is their attitude. To come before God without a whole heart, even offering sacrifices that weren't even according to what God desired. How bad and desperate do they need the word of the Lord, a message from God? You see, over the course of that 140 years or so before Malachi comes, God had provided a way back. He had provided for the temple to be restored. He had provided for the walls for protection. He had provided homes for them to live in. And out of having everything prepared and taken care of, they never made the right response. To give their whole heart to God out of gratitude. Now think about how many things we have that we should truly be thankful for that God has done for us. Number one, here's the blood of Christ. The blood that takes away all of our sin. Shouldn't that move us forward to want to honor God with everything we have? Just Christ alone would be plenty. But yet, what else does He offer us? Forgiveness, a confidence, a peace, a mercy, a joy. And to go, why would we not offer ourselves completely and totally back to God with honor? These people of Israel needed a message from God so desperately. And the sad part about it is they didn't even know it. Because it was that bad. They couldn't tell the difference between the wicked folks and the righteous folks. Now, look at verse 2. This is kind of, the only way I know how to describe it, this is kind of a conversational book. But it's conversational kind of in an odd way. Maybe if you have a husband or a wife that knows you so well that they can carry on the conversation without you. They already know what you think. This is vastly different in the fact of it's not a guess. With us, we guess and we get it wrong a lot, don't we? Here's God saying, here's what I'm telling you. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you what your response was going to be to this. And for them to sit there and hear this and go, you know, he's right. That's what I would have said. Then to go, and here's what you need to hear. You go, and here's what you're going to say to that. Only a God who knows the hearts and the minds of people can give a message like this, which tells you what level of interaction are we dealing with here between Israel and God. Does God know where they are? He says, I know exactly where you are, I know exactly how you think, and I know how you'll respond. Typically, we like to think, well, if they do this, then this is probably going to happen, and then that'll happen. And we think we know it all, and then all of a sudden it doesn't go that way. Here's God. Then I'm going to tell you the situation. Now, he starts here in verse 2. He says, I have loved you, says the Lord. But you say, how have you loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother, declares the Lord? Yet I have loved Jacob. Here's the beginning of the message. I have loved you. He's engaging them to say, look back in your life and you see if you can see my love in your life. Now I want you to think about that for us. Can you see in your life the effects of the love of God? How He has loved us? How He has cared for us? Here's a people who don't know the difference between righteousness and wickedness. And this is exactly where God begins the letter. He says, here's this prophecy coming from Malachi. He's my servant. He is my messenger. I have loved you. Notice where they're at in all this. Their response is, how have you loved us? What do you start to notice about the people? They don't seem to understand. They don't say, well, if the Lord said it, then that must be the way it is. They say, prove yourself. How have you loved us? Because they're so blind they can't see it. He says, how have you loved us? Then the Lord responds. And notice, I want you to kind of notice a little bit of a theme here. Look in verse 1. The oracle of the word of the Lord. Oh, you mean there's somebody we should be honoring to be submissive to? They didn't understand that. Verse 2, I have loved you, says the Lord. But you say, how have you loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother, declares the Lord? You're going to keep on seeing this, just so you know it. He says, was not Esau Jacob's brother? You look back into the book of Genesis, Jacob and Esau are brothers. They're actually seemingly twins. And to hit things together and to go, you know what? Esau's born first. And then so Esau should have had a birthright, should have had an inheritance. But God chose Jacob. And Jacob basically bought the birthright. And I want you to think about what all that means. A birthright meant, well, you got a double portion of the inheritance. So if there are two sons, then to get a double portion, you divide it by 3. But here's the thing. Jacob already had one portion. If he gets the birthright, how much does he have? All of it. It's all his. Now, and that was an honest deal on that one, because Esau did sell his birthright for a pot of red stew. He made the choice. Here's the thing. God's saying, look, I love Jacob. You're going to understand why here in a minute. Jacob's been given all 3 portions. It's his. All the inheritance is his. He says, was not Esau Jacob's brother, declares the Lord? Yet I have loved Jacob. And of course, Jacob's name is later on going to be changed to what? Israel. And who's this oracle to? It's to Israel. He says, the oracle of the word of the Lord to Israel, even though we are dealing with Judah and Levi as well. He says, yet I have loved Jacob. He says, you should be able to recognize that I love you. Now remember, where had they just been 150 years ago? Captivity. Is that normally what we think of? Oh, you really love me. Why did he put them in captivity? They didn't honor him. They weren't obedient. Even though God had provided a promised land for them. They rejected God. And because of that, God gave them over to be taken. Because that's what they needed. Now, notice we kind of stop in the middle of a sentence here in verse 2. He says, yet I have loved Jacob, verse 3, but I have hated Esau. Ooh, hated. He says, and I have made his mountains a desolation and appointed his inheritance for the jackals of the wilderness. What happened to all the greatness of Esau? Desolate. And who lives there now? A bunch of wild animals, a bunch of jackals. I mean, if you ever take something down and nobody lives there anymore, animals will come in and take it. I mean, that's just the way it goes. He says, you know what? I have loved Jacob, but I have hated Esau, and I have made his mountains a desolation. Who did it? The Lord did it. Now, Why do you think, you tell me, why do you think the very first thing God wants to show Israel about what happens to those that God hates? Why do you think He wants to bring that up just right here at the beginning? Because they weren't honoring Him. And what's going to happen to them? The same thing's going to happen. Now, He comes through, says, I have hated Esau, and I have made his mountains a desolation, and appointed his inheritance for the jackals of the wilderness. What happened to his inheritance? It came to what? It came to nothing. Sounds just like the way it was supposed to be, right? You come to this point, and what sticks out to you in verse 3? What catches your attention that maybe seems odd about the Lord? Hated. He hated Esau. Typically, we say God is love. But now, the Lord hated Esau? Oh, man. Well, let's take a little thought here. Go back to the book of Deuteronomy. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 12. Look down at verse 28. Of course, this is God giving this message to Moses. They're about a month before they're going to go over and take the promised land. Moses will be dead by then, but this is what he gives. Deuteronomy chapter 12, look at verse 28. Be careful to listen to all these words which I command you, so that it may be well with you and your sons after you forever. For you will be doing what is good and right in the sight of the Lord your God. What happens when you listen to God's commands? It will go well with you. And what will you be able to tell the difference between? Right and wrong. Okay. To know what's good and right in the sight of the Lord your God. Verse 29. When the Lord your God cuts off before you the nations which you are going in to dispossess, and you dispossess them and dwell in their land, beware that you are not ensnared to follow them after they are destroyed before you, and that you do not inquire after their gods, saying, how do these nations serve their gods that I may do likewise? He says, keep in mind, you're going in because these nations are what? Evil. He says, they're condemned. He says, don't go in and start asking questions about their gods. About, well, maybe we can just serve them. Doesn't that sound about like the foolish thing? Here's a bunch of people you just went in and conquered and going, maybe we ought to serve their gods. It's because of your God that you took over the land, right? It's because of the God that we serve that we have clothes to wear, food to eat, houses to live in, and we're going to turn against Him? Now, notice how he continues here, verse 31. He says, you shall not behave thus toward the Lord your God, for every abominable act which the Lord hates. They have done for their gods, for they even burn their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods. Notice the word. He says, every abominable act. In the Hebrew language, the word abominable is really more of a sound than it is an actual word. It's the sound you make when you throw up. It's a sound. In other words, we would say, this is so despicable, it makes me sick. It makes me want to throw up. These 7 nations that Israel is going to come in and destroy and take out, how wicked are they? They're abominable. And they are so abominable, what's the response of the Lord? He hates them. Now, he says he hates these things that they're doing for their gods. They even burn their children to these foreign gods. Wouldn't that make your stomach turn? To hear about people who would take their children and offer them up in sacrifice? Now, verse 32, whatever I command you, you shall be careful to do. You shall not add to nor take away from it. How careful does he want them to be with his commands? Very careful. Don't take away from it. Don't add to it. And in order to have this kind of relationship, do you have to have honor for God? Yes. Because if you don't have honor, what happens to commands? If they're convenient, I'll do them. If they're not, I won't. And you realize how wicked those nations were that God dispossessed of the promised land to give it to his people Israel. Now, let's hold on to this thought and move a little bit further. Look over at Proverbs chapter 6. Let's give this a little more grip to us. Proverbs chapter 6. Look down at verse 16. Remember, we're still working off of that idea there in Malachi. Look, the Lord hates Esau. Why do you think he's going to hate him? Is it because he's chosen to honor God? Let's see this hate played out a little bit more. Proverbs chapter 6, look at verse 16. There are 6 things which the Lord hates. And that's the right word. The Lord hates them. He says, yes, 7 which are an abomination to him. He says, oh, it just makes him sick. Wants to throw up. Here's those 7. Verse 17. Haughty eyes. He says, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that run rapidly to evil, a false witness who utters lies, and one who spreads strife among brothers. He says, you really want God as your enemy? Just pick one of those. You want God to stand against you? Be a false witness. Start obscuring justice. Have a lying tongue. Have haughty eyes where you look down on others because they're not as good as you. He says, just run quickly to cut down the innocent. Do you see what the Lord hates? Do you see how our attitude should be to have none of these things named among us as God's people? They should have no part in us whatsoever. Now, let me show you what happens to people who carry these type of things out. Look over at Proverbs chapter 26. Proverbs chapter 26, look down at verse 24. Look at the language here, but let's be careful with it. Verse 24. He who hates, now this is the individual, this is not God. This is the individual. He who hates disguises it with his lips, but he lays up deceit in his heart. Now, if you talk to him, he hates you, but what does it sound like? Well, he's got a good disguise on. His words don't come across like he hates you. He talks really nice to you. But man, in his heart, he hates you. Ooh, sound like pretty rough. Verse 25. When he speaks graciously, do not believe him, for there are 7 abominations in his heart. What does he want to do with you, the innocent? He wants to kill you. How does he look at you? With haughty eyes. What does he speak about you? He speaks lies. You go, and this is one disgusting man. This is the type of person that the Lord hates because of his attitude, because of his actions, because of his thinking. Because none of those things honor God, do they? None of those 7 abominations that we read in Proverbs 6, none of them have a relationship with God. None of them honor God. So now he says, when he speaks these gracious words, he says, you know what? It's all disguises and deceit. He says there are 7 abominations in his heart. He keep you sick for a week. He's so disgusting. Verse 26. Though his hatred covers itself with guile, there's the deceit. He says, his wickedness will be revealed before the assembly. What's going to happen to him? It's going to be laid bare before everybody. He may be able to disguise it for a little while. When you don't honor God, it's going to be laid open before everybody. And you know exactly why. Now, come back over to Malachi chapter 1. So when you look at verse 3 and he makes these statements about, but I have hated Esau. Does God hate him just because he chose to hate him? Or does it have to do with Esau's choices and decisions? He sold his birthright. He gave up all of his inheritance for one bowl of stew. I guess he didn't understand that God would take care of him. Sometimes worry and anxiety will do those kind of things to us. They'll make us do very foolish things. Now, he continues here in verse 3. He says, I made his mountain a desolation. Is it widely known? Yeah. And appointed his inheritance for the jackals of the wilderness. Verse 4. Though Edom, of course, Edom is the descendants of who? Esau. He says, though Edom says, we have been beaten down, but we will return and build up the ruins. Bring it on. You may destroy us, but we'll build it back. What you're seeing is man's attitude versus God's power. And man says, we'll just come back stronger. Oh, really? You really think so? Well, he says, we have been beaten down, but we will return and build up the ruins. If there are ruins, what does that tell you? God took you down already. He said, yeah, but we're going to show him. Oh, really? Okay. Then, notice again in verse 4. He says, thus says the Lord of hosts. Are you getting this idea of Lord being kind of a theme through this book yet? Put that little feather in your mind there. He says, they may build, but I will tear down. He says, and men will call them the wicked territory. Oh, notice how God distinguishes things. You're wicked, so what do? I destroy. I tear you down. Now, notice how he continues. He says, and the people toward whom the Lord is indignant forever. No return. He says, for them, he says, I'm going to destroy them because I hate them. And I don't just hate them because I want to. I hate them because they've made their choices to not honor me. And though they try to rebuild, what happens? It's torn down and destroyed. They may build it up, but what's God going to do again? Tear it down. There are some places, it always amazes me, they've been destroyed time and time and time and time again on earth, and what do? They go, well, just build it back. And then what happens? It gets destroyed again. And you go, let's do some thinking. Let's be a little more wise here. And if you want to really take a thought of it, if you remember at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, the story of the one who hears the words of Jesus and acts on them, he's like a builder who dug down to the rock and built his life, established his life on the rock, on the teachings of Jesus. And when the great storms come, what happens to his house? It stands firm. What about whenever you disregard the words of Jesus and you build out there on the sand? What's going to happen in your life? When the storms come, it's all going to fall. And you go, well, we'll just build it back. But we're still not going to work it on Jesus. And what happens again? It falls again. Now, let's make a little application. What about in our lives? What about in our marriage if we're not honoring Jesus? What do you think is going to happen? It's not going to last very well. And even if it functions, it won't function very well. What about in parenting with our children? What if we don't honor Jesus in that, to hold to His ways about what's right and what's wicked? It's not going to go very well. We'll find ourselves rebooting over and over again, looking for what's the next thing? How should we try and do it? And until we build it on Jesus, will there be any stability? No. You start to realize these seeds that we're looking at, they have a direct effect even on us now. Now, here they were, wicked, indignant. He said, I'm indignant forever, because they're not changing. Verse 5, he says, your eyes will see this, and you will say, the Lord be magnified beyond the border of Israel. He says, Israel, you're going to see this in looking at Esau and Edom, and you're going to go, this is magnificent. This is exactly what God does. And if you notice the statement, he says, the Lord be magnified beyond the border of Israel. Is the Lord going to just be for Israel, or is what Jesus is going to do going to be for everyone? Everyone. Here's what I really enjoy about this statement in verse 5. The Lord be magnified. What do you do when you put a magnifying glass on something? It allows you to see more deeply into the object, doesn't it? It doesn't literally make the object bigger. It just means you can look more exactly at Him. He says, what do you think this message from God is going to do for Israel? I'm going to allow you to really look at yourself. And let's magnify the Lord so that you can understand where you need to be in this honor thing. Now, Lord willing, next week we'll come back. We'll pick up in verse 6. So have a good week.